Hi, my name is Ariel Nidenson, and I'm the Assistant Director of Research Integrity in Brown's Office of Research Integrity and the Chair of Brown's Love Data Week Planning Committee. Welcome to Brown's fourth annual Love Data Week, co-sponsored by the Office of the Vice President for Research and the University Library. Love Data Week is an international celebration of data aiming to raise awareness and build a community to engage on topics related to research data management, sharing, preservation, reuse, and library-based research data services. This year's Love Data Week theme is sharing data, seeking justice, and building trust, with over 30 events running from today, February 13th, through Saturday, February 18th. We invite you to check out Love Data Week's full list of remote, hybrid, and in-person events from the link we'll put in the chat. I would now like to welcome you to Love Data Week's keynote speaker, Professor Suresh Venkatasubramanian, a professor of computer science and data science at Brown. During his presentation, please feel free to use the Q&A function, and Suresh will answer your questions after the talk. Suresh's background is in algorithmic and computational geometry, as well as data mining and machine learning. His current research interests lie in algorithmic fairness, and more generally, the impact of automated decision-making systems in society. Suresh recently finished a stint in the Biden-Harris administration, where he served as the Assistant Director for Science and Justice in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. In that capacity, he helped co-author the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights. Prior to Brown, Suresh was at the University of Utah, where as an assistant professor, he was the John and Marva Warnick Assistant Professor and received a career award from the NSF for his work in the geometry of probability. He has received a Test of Time Award at ICDE 2017 for his work in privacy. His research on algorithmic fairness has received press coverage across North America and Europe, including NPR's Science Friday, NBC, and CNN, as well as in other media outlets. He is a past member of the Computing Community Consortium Council of the CRA, spent 4 years from 2017 to 2021 as a member of the board of the ACLU in Utah, and is a past member of New York City's Failure to Appear Tool, or FTA, Research Advisory Council, the Research Advisory Council for the First Judicial District of Pennsylvania, and the Utah State Auditor's Commission on Protecting Privacy and Preventing Discrimination. Suresh's presentation is entitled Repairing the Algorithmic Lens. Please join me in welcoming Suresh.
Thank you very much, Ariel, and thank you all of you for having me here today. It's an honor. As Ariel mentioned, I'm the Deputy Director of the Data Science Institute and the Director of the Center for Technological Responsibility, Reimagination, and Redesign. These are two things that are true as of 2 days ago, so I'm very happy to sort of be speaking to you just after our institute and the center was approved. So I'm a card-carrying computer scientist, as Ariel mentioned, something that frankly often confuses people that hear me speak. I've spent years working in the trenches of data science, high-dimensional geometry, theoretical computer science, before I started thinking about the broader impacts of technology, especially data-driven algorithms on society. For the last 10 years, I have been studying the ways in which tech and society collide and what falls out of these often violent collisions. I've spent time, as you heard, working in civil society and government, and most recently spent time at the White House helping develop a blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights. And I said earlier that I'm the director for the Center for Technological Responsibility, Reimagination, and Redesign. So what on earth is that? So it's a new center under the Data Science Institute, and it's really a reflection of the fact that in recent years, the influence of computer science and all the technologies it's enabled has moved beyond infrastructure and touches all aspects of society, especially with huge, very hungry data-driven algorithms. But this field was never really designed to address the problems of people, groups, or societies. The issues that have come up as tech collides society have assumed an outsized importance because automated decision-making has become an integral element in society, affecting people's rights, opportunities for advancement, access to critical needs and services. And the problem is that rather than bring about the democratization that technology often promises, data-driven systems can amplify and exacerbate existing inequities and power relationships within society. So that's a long way of saying that the mission of the center is to redefine how we do computer science, how we do education, research, and how we build tech, to center the needs, problems, and aspiration of people, of all of us, and especially those that technology has left behind. Now, I say computer science and I say technology, but of course, data and technology are intertwined to the point where it's actually very, very hard to tell what is a piece of code and what is a piece of data. We couldn't have the wonders of AI today without the big data era from 10 years ago. And new tech generates new data that feeds back into new tech. And there's a symbiotic relationship between the technology we use and the data that feeds it. And this has been recognized, right? As much as 10 years ago, well, not 10 years ago, but about 7 years ago, there was a report on the relationship of big data, as people used to talk about it then, and civil rights and its opportunities for us as well as its harms. And you could think of this as almost a precursor to the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights that came out this year that I helped develop, that sort of talks about data-driven algorithms and what we can do to make sure that they actually do work for all of us. So what I'd like to do here today is maybe reflect on the themes of the Love Data Week and talk about how I think about concerns around technology in the context of these three themes, and then leave you all with a challenge as you go through this week of activities, a problem that I don't yet know how to solve, but I feel like we do need to figure out a way of solving. And then maybe all of you together, as you think about your work with data, are able to come up with a solution to it. So that's the plan. So let's start with the themes. And the first theme is sharing data. So it's hard to understate how important the fact of having access to data, being able to share data has been. And so rather than just sort of say that over and over again, I thought I'd maybe give you two brief examples in the work that I do, or not the work that I've experienced, as to where this has been, the ability to share data and collect and look at it has been very, very important for pushing our understanding of tech and society forward. The first example is in an area which is called pretrial risk assessments, and more broadly, the data in the criminal justice realm. So one thing that you may not be aware of is that algorithms, data-driven machine learning algorithms, are being used much more frequently now in the criminal justice system to make decisions about people's liberty. So for example, in this particular case, when someone is arraigned on a charge, that means they've been arrested and they've been charged with a crime, a judge has to make a decision as to whether they be released on bail, released on their own merits without any supervision, released with some electronic monitoring, or not released at all, based on criteria that vary from state to state. And so this assessment of whether they should be released based on whether they'll show up in court for their trial or whether they'll be a danger to the community while out on bail is often now being done by an algorithm that collects data from historical examples and builds a model to predict someone's risk, hence the term risk assessment. In 2016, the magazine ProPublica put out a report studying the way these risk assessments were being used in different localities, and they focused on one area in Florida, in Broward County. And what they discovered is that these tools are often very biased. They're biased against people from underrepresented demographic groups. In the case of policing, it's often African-American minorities that are sort of affected greatly by these tools just because they are built on historical data, which itself is tremendously biased. And there was a lot of, this was a very impactful report in the sense that it really changed the conversation in the public sphere around thinking about risk assessment tools and the concerns around them. But one thing that ProPublica did that was very important is that, and since then, the folks who've done this work, like Julia Angwin and Surya Matu with Markup and others as well, have done this regularly, is they not only wrote the report, they put out a detailed methodology of what they did, and to the extent possible, within the realms of privacy preservation, they released data that people could look at. They shared their data. As a result of sharing their data, a very different thing started happening as well. Researchers across the country started looking into this data. They started trying to sort of play with it and understand ways in which different kinds of algorithms would have different kinds of problems in addressing the concerns that the ProPublica article raised. And it sort of spawned a broad discussion within the academic community, within the civil rights community, and broadly among policymakers about what is the right way to design, if at all. Ariel mentioned early on that I sat on 2 advisory boards for different localities that were trying to build risk assessment tools. The fact that I was on those boards, the fact that I was in those conversations was because of the initial work of putting out this report, sharing this data, and making sure this discussion could be open. Another perhaps less visible example of the value of sharing data is how social media companies handle the problems of misinformation, and in particular, combating very violent and often misogynistic and horrific content that gets spread from the dark web and sometimes shows up on social media. Now, one might argue that these companies aren't necessarily doing a very good job of it, but for certain, there is a lot of content that's really horrific and absolutely should not be getting into your feeds that is being blocked. And it's being blocked only because, and this is not as well known in the public, these companies, which are ostensibly in competition with each other, actually coordinate efforts among what I call trust and safety divisions in different companies to coordinate and share data information about different kinds of problematic content so that they can, in a coordinated way, block it, especially if it's getting through filters on one site versus getting through filters on another site, and so on. And what we know about misinformation is that trends tend to jump from one platform to another. So even if one platform cannot work on its own, you must share data between platforms to do this, even platforms that compete with each other. And we're seeing, some benefits of doing so. There's much more to be done, but this is a very clear example where data sharing has really helped us do something better in terms of content moderation. The next theme of the workshop is seeking justice. And let me tell you about another example. Facebook allows you to place ads. For example, as a homeowner, you can place ads for renting out your house and control where these ads are shown with very fine-grained keyword specification. You could, if you so wished, prevent your ads from being seen by people from one group, or only preferentially show the ads to people from a different group. You could do this if you were renting a house. You could do this if you were offering a job. And in these cases, doing so, preferentially showing ads to people from one group or blocking people from another group, is discriminatory and illegal. And Facebook was allowing it. And we only know this because of very careful third-party auditing and data collection by journalists and researchers. In this case, of course, data was being used to monitor the data that was collected by these third-party auditors, monitoring where the ads were being placed and who they were being targeted to. It was being used to monitor and police unjust behavior that was being facilitated by a tech company. It wasn't, Facebook wasn't doing this, but it was facilitating these activities. And this is a very important tool, a way in which data is very powerful, to seek justice in this way, to illuminate what might be going on under the covers and show and illustrate where disparities might be occurring. Now, in this case, it was being used, we use the data to monitor unfair behavior. But data can also be used to make visible those who've been rendered invisible by the flattening effect of technology. One example of this is a very beautiful effort that was first outlined in an article just this past year. Who owns our data? A community, the Maori community in New Zealand, was concerned about the slow death of the Maori language, mostly because of colonization and cultural pressures, and especially the onslaught of English language culture coming from the West, from social media, from the companies that are based in the US. And what they did was they used data collection, very detailed collection of spoken language from Maori speakers, a rapidly sort of growing extinct group at the time, to build their own indigenous data source, a database of the Maori language, of audio clips, of ways to build essentially translation tools, or of speech to text, or of text to speech generation in Maori. This was a very interesting effort because it was in some sense fighting what people have often called data colonialism, where the flattening effect of technology and the flattening effect of culture, especially Western culture, especially English-speaking culture, has made it very hard for communities in places where to retain and preserve their own culture, their own language, their own way of interacting with each other. And so in this case, again, data is not being used to fight and reveal injustice, but is being used to build up and protect those who have been so far ignored or left unseen by the homogenizing effect of technology. And what about building trust? Well, the question is trust in what? We've all heard of, we've all heard of the COVID trackers. I think we've all spent many, many hours, probably more hours than we should have been sitting on COVID trackers. This was a data source. It was a database with a very nice rendering on top of it that was showing us for all these past years what was happening with COVID in the world, in the country, in your own locality. What was the vaccine rates? What were the different strain rates? I don't know about you, but I spent a lot of time on this site and sites like it, compulsively just looking every day to understand what is going on. And maybe, maybe I shouldn't have been. Maybe I shouldn't have been paying so much close attention, or maybe it was just a way of releasing all the fear that we felt during these past few years. But one thing that this data source did was it provided a way for all of us to understand what was happening. The data that this tracker collected and displayed helped build some sense of shared trust and understanding in where the world was. Now, of course, none of these things are perfect, as we know. There's still been lots of disagreement about the effects of COVID or how seriously one should take it and so on. But this, for what it's worth, having data sources like this and others by the Atlantic Monthly and other entities helped establish a common framework, a baseline that we could start from. That even though we might argue on what we should be doing about a particular variant or about vaccines, we at least had the numbers to tell us what was going on. And that trust, that establishment of trust, is something that data is very effective at doing and was very effective at doing in this case. It's unfortunate that I'm putting up this slide now because the JHU tracker just announced that they'll be shutting down. I guess they have decided that they're done with data collection for the pandemic. But trust means many different things as well, right? So in the world of technology, sometimes the question is, how do we trust the results that technology is giving us? And so then there are different ways of expressing that. There's a whole area, for example, of explanations, where what you want to do is extract data from your algorithm and the way it's working to ascertain whether it's doing what you think it's doing. When an algorithm makes some kind of prediction about someone's risk score for not showing up in court, it should, the question you want to ask is why, what factors does it take into account, and how significant are these factors? And this whole new area of explanations is trying to help us understand those things better. It's all about trust, but it's about a different kind of trust in this case. Of course, there is a dark side of all of this. We've talked about the importance of sharing data, but sharing data has become an economic enterprise in itself with data brokers. And now we're seeing all kinds of problematic activities where data brokers collect data or data sources of data from various places. They collect it and they sell it to others, and your information is being monetized for other people's benefits. For example, the FTC is suing one company for selling data that tracks people who go to reproductive health clinics and other sensitive locations. Another article that came out a few months ago reported that a Roomba, which was going around the room doing its thing, was recording images and recorded a woman sitting on a toilet, and somehow uploaded this in some way, shared the data, and this picture ended up on Facebook at some point. So while sharing data has been a key important factor to uncovering problems and working together to solve big problems, there's also the challenge that sharing data can lead to further problems and leakage of information about people. When it comes to seeking justice, one of the goals of doing data collection and data analysis is to help see what is being hidden, is to reveal information that we would not have seen before. But of course, the problem is once you do that, you are very close to getting to surveillance systems that will surveil those who can't push back. The book by Virginia Eubanks, Automating Equality, writes very eloquently about how those who are too poor and needs the support of the government end up being subject to all kinds of intrusive surveillance that we would find oppressive if we were subjected to it as well. And so the challenge of using data to reveal and to seek justice comes with the flip side that often the same systems that are put in place to do this can then be used to surveil us. And when it comes to building trust, of course, the topic du jour, and I feel remiss not mentioning it, of course, is ChatGPT. And ChatGPT and systems like it, like DALL-E, like Stable Diffusion, they simulate authenticity without being real by being extremely persuasive. And that can also lead to all kinds of negative consequences for building trust. In fact, I decided to ask ChatGPT what I thought about this. And ChatGPT was, reasonably careful in its answer, which I guess is good for now, but we'll see what happens in the future. So if you think of all of these dimensions to the importance of data, how we share data, how we seek justice using data, and how we want to build trust using data, there are a number of themes that come up, ways in which we've tried to understand how we use data in our world to understand, to analyze, to intervene. And so when I started thinking, I've been thinking about, what are the things we could do? What are projects we could embark on that make use of all the data we're collecting, but in a way that maybe is more helpful, is more beneficial to all of us, rather than being something that merely gets monetized and merely gets a source of income for those who control our data while taking away control from us. And then that led me to pondering, the different ways in which we do use data, and we've seen data being used effectively. And so I want to give you 3 examples of that, and then maybe posit a challenge for the audience to think about over the next few days and over the next few months and years. A challenge that I'd love to, see solutions to, even if whether I come up with it myself or someone else does. So what are these challenges and how can we think about them? One thing data does very powerfully is help us tell stories. So Mona Chalabi, the data journalist from The Guardian, very well-known data journalist who does amazing illustrations, was actually here last week at an event jointly organized by the Data Science Institute and the Brown Arts Institute, talking about her work as a data journalist and the importance of visualization in a data-driven world. And so this is just one example of their, often whimsical, but very, very cutting and insightful, I would say, illustration that she does. Right. So this is a graph of average number of trees by neighborhood income. And you can look at the clever way the graph has been drawn. She mentioned in a talk that she likes to use as few numbers as possible and just let the picture tell the story. And I think you can see that it's very easy to see here what the picture is telling you, without sort of banging it into your head. It's very artfully done. And the important thing is the little thing in the text below the picture, that she uses data from a New York City Parks tree census. Yes, there is a New York City Parks tree census, which I did not know existed, which involves volunteers literally going out regularly to collect information about trees. It's fascinating. And the Census Bureau. A lot of her work involves going to data sources, either published by governments or by private entities, and analyzing data coming from there to find interesting patterns that are significant to us. Something about a picture of how the number of trees in your neighborhood varies based on income is very important once you think about it. When you think of the importance of trees, the way trees can clean the air, the way trees have been, as Mona mentioned in her talk, the way trees have been shown to help with transmission of COVID, the way trees create a sense of community. This graph suddenly becomes a lot more important once you think about that. And this idea that data can help us tell stories is something that sort of is core to her work and is a very important way to think about the value of the data collection we do. Can it help us tell stories about our world? And it doesn't have to be stories in the aggregate. It can be stories about people. It can be stories about individuals. And if we can collect data that helps us do that, those are sometimes the most effective stories we can be telling. Data helps us understand trends in society. The Pew Research Center does surveys on a regular basis of how the public understands trends. These surveys are often very helpful as policymakers try to think about how to prioritize different goals, how to prioritize what people care about, because after all, government needs to be responsive to what people care about, as well as sort of directing where people see there needs to be further efforts. And so in this case, right, there is a survey on how people think about AI and human enhancement applications and what they think of as more acceptable or less acceptable. This data is people data. It's data from opinions. It's aggregated and synthesized and rendered in this way. And it helps us understand trends, especially a survey like this. Doing it every year or so, every couple of years, gives you a sense of how the population is moving, how people are changing the way they think about technology, about AI, about other ways of collecting data. There are other surveys like this that talk about the use of AI in different contexts and whether people feel comfortable being hired by a system that uses AI or admitted to college and so on. And so in this case, having data that we collect, but that collect regularly over periods of time, helps us understand these trends or helps us understand how people are thinking about different trends in society. And that's another sort of very fascinating use of data in this regard. A third trend is that data helps us understand complex systems. So this chart is from MarketWatch. It's an informal name for this would be the data calendar. And it's basically a list, and you can go to this website and you can see this list every week. What economic indicators are going to be released, and also what conversations from policymakers in the economic world, from the federal government, from the Fed, Railroad Reserve, U.S. Treasury, and so on, will be happening. So if you look at these numbers, they give you the numbers that these are the expected numbers from last time and what they numbers from last time, what they expect to see, and so on. All these numbers come out. You've probably heard of some of them, like the inflation numbers came out this week, or the employment numbers, or the consumer price index, and so on. So none of these numbers by themselves gives you a complete picture of what's happening in the US economy. But these numbers together as a collection of signals helps understand what is frankly a very complicated system that almost feels like it has a life of its own, that does its own thing, and that we can only kind of get a glimpse at. And people who work in the markets, policymakers, the public at large, watch these numbers very carefully to get a sense of what's happening in the economy at any point in time and where trends may be going. And just like in the previous case, these numbers are released regularly. Some are released once a week, some are released once a month, some are released once every quarter, and so on. And so this longitudinal effect of releasing this data allows people to calibrate in their own minds what these numbers mean and how to interpret any change in any one of these numbers. So I think of this as signals, right? If you have a smoke alarm or you have a bunch of other detectors in your house sensing different things, if a smoke alarm goes off upstairs but not downstairs, and you have a upstairs downstairs house, it's not only telling you that there's smoke somewhere, it's telling you where it's coming from, right? Because one sensor is not going off and one is. Any sensor by itself would not be as useful, but all of these sensors put together start to paint a picture of, again, a very complex system. And again, the fact that it's longitudinal gives you a sense of calibration. So this brings me to the challenge, the question I have for all of us. And the question is this: what would a data dashboard look like? What does a dashboard to monitor technology in society look like? What could we do with it? Could we monitor the deployment of human-facing tech? Could we monitor its effectiveness across the board? I mean, even the number of places where, how many companies are now using resume scanners in their systems to hire people? If we understood the prevalence of technology, we can understand the scope and impact. If we can understand how effective these tools are, we understand whether they're actually working. Can we ask questions about the disparities these tools create or mitigate? Can we get a survey of, we are using risk assessment tools in courts across the country. We've now collected data on these tools for 2 years. This is what we now know. Just like the ProPublica study that did it for one county at one point in time, but regularly. What kind of signals should we measure, and how might they guide our interventions? Again, I don't know the answers to any of these questions. I'm going to emphasize that right now. But it seems to me that what we are living in right now is somewhat of a fog, where we have a lot of promises about what technology can offer us. We have a lot of concerns about what technology could be doing. And we have very little. Well, it's not that we don't have data. We have lots of individual case studies and examples we don't have a way to survey the landscape of tech across the board in ways that might be useful, just like we saw with economic systems or with the ways society and culture evolves over time. My feeling is that if we could do this, we would be able to have a much more informed discussion about tech. We would have a much more grounded discussion about its harms and benefits. We would be able to guide more effectively policymakers. And I feel this very strongly, having been one for a while and having to answer questions like, well, should we do this or should we do that? And saying, we just don't know. An answer doesn't get you many friends in the policy world. And so if we can use these things to guide interventions, to guide our understanding, to shape where we would like technology to go, to make sure it's actually helping us instead of controlling us, I think that would be fantastic. And I think that a data dashboard is one key component of being able to do that. So I like having conversations. I don't generally like talking at people. So I would like to stop now and leave you with this question, leave you with these thoughts, and invite you to come in, to start a conversation amongst yourselves, maybe with me for the next few minutes, and see where we can go with this. And I'd love to see next year at the Love Data Week, someone with an example of a data dashboard that we could be using to tell stories, to understand trends, and to understand this complex system that is tech and society. With that, I will thank you for your time. I'm Suresh at brown.edu. If you wish to reach out to me, I'm at the Data Science Institute, and I lead the Center for Tech Responsibility. Thank you very much for having me here.
Thank you so much, Suresh. That was a really interesting conversation. I very much appreciated it. Right now, we don't have questions in the chat, but I have some questions for you. But for everyone watching, please put any questions that you have down again. I'm sorry, I said chat. I meant the Q&A function. So my question is, in the Office of Research Integrity, I do a lot of work with data sharing. And so obviously that part of your talk was very interesting to me. And you would discuss some of the benefits of data sharing, between social media apps. And you also mentioned some of the negatives that are associated with data sharing, and how personal information can be leaked and how there's all sorts of problems there. And I'm sure you're aware that several of our federal funders are in the process of trying to make data as open as possible. I'm thinking specifically of the new NIH policy for data management and sharing. And so I was just curious about your thoughts on this and really that balancing act between the positives and the negatives of data sharing.
That's a great question. And yes, I'm very proud to have watched from a distance at OSTP all the work that was going around on pushing open science that folks at OSTP were leading, and they did an amazing job doing that. It's interesting you bring this up because there are so many different dimensions of sharing to unpack here. For example, if we look at COVID trackers, we talk about the NIH data sharing policy. What we're talking about is how can we make sure that data that is generated in the course of doing science, of understanding our world, understanding issues of health, understanding treatments, can be made as accessible to people as possible, can be made as accessible to other researchers as possible, so that these conversations can move a lot faster and that the public can understand, what is it we're learning about all the things we're studying that affect us. And there, I would say, there is very little in the way of harm, in the sense that we must share this data. It is a responsible thing to do. And it really does help kickstart much more accelerated research. I mean, the kind of research that was happening with COVID, because of all the vast amounts of sharing and preprint sharing, was a lot faster than it has been in the past, precisely because there was this sense that we should just put everything out there that we understand so that people can pick up on it. Now, the challenge, of course, is that when things, what people saw over the past few years was science in action. Something that scientists maybe were not particularly surprised by, but maybe the public was, to show how messy it is and how much back and forth there is and how much it's two steps forward. We thought we understood. Oh, wait a second. Now we're not sure anymore. This is the reality of scientists' work. There's always, we think we're doing this, we think we're right, and actually we're wrong, and we just keep evolving. But seeing it in the public sphere like this made, I think people are a little bit uncomfortable. Like, wait, are we sure these scientists know what they're talking about? They keep changing their mind. That's at least a perception. And so I think, along with data sharing comes the responsibility to make sure that people don't accidentally misinterpret the data as it comes out. And B, that we protect against actors who are deliberately trying to manipulate and spread disinformation about data that comes out. So I think while the sharing itself is great, we have to be careful and a little bit concerned about, not concerned, but at least careful and prudent about how we talk about and how we communicate about the data that's being shared. So that's one thing. But I think in other places, when it comes to the commercial use of data, the key issue there is we don't have any control or say over how our data is being shared and used. So one of the things that I worked on, as you mentioned, was the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights. And there are 5 principles there. The one that's most relevant to this conversation is relevant to data privacy. And it's not just about privacy, it's also about data use. We should have the right to decide how our data gets used. And we frankly don't fully yet have the technology for that. We have things called privacy enhancing technologies that help protect our data. That means that we can do inferences on data without seeing it, which is great. That means if a company wants to do some inferences to make recommendations to us, they can do it in our data without actually seeing it, which sounds like magic, but in fact, there's a whole bunch of research doing that. There's work that's happening within the center saying, so I want to provide my data for some research purpose, but I want to make sure this data is deleted within a month. And I'm not just going to trust you and rely on you to do it. I am going to put my data into a specially designed cryptographic system so that you can use it for exactly 30 days. And after 30 days, it disappears. And there's no one anything needs to do about it. Again, it sounds like magic, but that's what folks in the center are working on. And I can say this with great pride because I have nothing to do with it. There's just other folks doing this work. It's amazing. And that's kind of mind-blowing that you can do that kind of work. And so I think what's interesting in the world of sharing data is, where do we want to share data? Who do we want to share it with? Who gets control and authority over it? And how do we make sure that we have the tools to enable the people who should have control over the data to actually have control over it?
Great, thank you. That's super interesting. And I actually agree with a lot of those thoughts as well. And actually related to the AI Bill of Rights that you just mentioned, we do have a question, which is someone wants you to talk more specifically about the goals of the AI Bill of Rights and also some of the challenges that you ran into while working on it.
So the AI Bill of Rights consists of 5 principles. And there's a long version of them. And you can look it up at, I think it's whitehouse.gov/ I don't know the exact URL, but I'm sure if you Google White House AI Bill of Rights, you'll find it.
We'll put it in the chat.
Thank you. There are 5 principles. Number 1, technology, automated systems. So first of all, the concern of the AI Bill of Rights is with automated systems, not just AI, not just machine learning, any automated system that has a meaningful impact on people, which means it impacts our civil rights. It impacts our opportunities for advancement, like employment, like credit, like loans. And it affects our access to services that we need from the government, like whether it's like unemployment benefits or welfare programs and so on. And for any such system that is used, and I don't care if it's a spreadsheet or if it's a fancy deep learning system, if it affects us meaningfully, then that system should be safe and effective. It should work. You'd be surprised how many systems are put out in the world that in fact don't work or don't have evidence that they work. So that's the first thing. It should work. Secondly, it should not discriminate. It should not result in discrimination against people from different communities. And this is very broad, right? It's discrimination based on race, based on gender, based on sexual orientation, based on national origin, based on religion, based on economic status. It should not do that. Based on disability. Thirdly, people should have a right to control the data that gets used in these systems and decide how and when it gets propagated on. And systems should not collect data from one group, sell it to another group, and sell it to another group without permission. Number 4, and we talked about building trust. We should know that these systems are in place. They shouldn't be built in secret. There should be a right to notice, and we should know how they work. They should have to explain themselves. There should be some clear articulation of how these systems work. And that should depend on who's asking, right? If I'm asking, if I go to a doctor and they use some system, like systems are often being used now to scan an MRI and make some diagnosis, I might want to know how it worked. But more importantly, the doctor should know how it worked and whether that prediction makes any sense from a medical point of view. But if a system is being used to decide whether to give me a loan, I have the right to know why that system is making a decision about me, especially if it's a negative decision, and based on what factors. And I have a right to know that. So that's number 4. And the 5th one is that we should recognize that automation will break, will always break. We can get better and better at it, but it will break, and there should be backups. There should be human alternatives. There should be human consideration of the process. Because talking to a person means you actually talk to a person, not to a robot. I don't know if you would like talking to ChatGPT if your loan gets denied. I certainly wouldn't. So these 5 principles, safe and effective, don't discriminate, let us control our data, let us know how systems work, and let there be human backups, are the core principles of the AI Bill of Rights. And the goal is to ensure that any system that gets put out there in a human-facing setting must adhere to these principles. And in fact, the document, if I told you this 5 rights, this is a 2-page document. It's actually a 73-page document because we spent a lot of time listing out exactly how a system would need to comply with these principles. And so that's what the goals are. And the goal is great. Everywhere in the country, any system that gets deployed that touches you should be in compliance with this. Are we there yet? No, but we're planning to be there. That's the goal.
Great. And what were some of the challenges you faced while working to draft this document?
There are many challenges. And I think the biggest challenge is that, and this is going to sound trite, right? The world is a very complicated place. And giving you cookie cutter rules that need to apply to every system just doesn't work. So trying to figure out a balance between high level principles that sound great but don't mean anything, and things that are awfully detailed but only apply in one specific corner of the world was the biggest struggle we faced in hitting the right spot between being broad and general and being specific. And that was a challenge because, the way in which algorithms and data gets used in employment is slightly different in an important way to the way they get used in child welfare risk assessments. But it's slightly different and important way to how they get used in criminal justice risk assessments. So they're different, but the reason I talk about those 3 at the same time is because they use the same underlying data technology. So there's something that's similar and there's something that's different. And so trying to figure out that right balance, what in computer science we call the right layer of abstraction, but the right level of specificity versus generality to be useful and constructive was, I think, the biggest challenge we faced.
Great, thank you. So I want to talk a little more about, bias in algorithms. And a question came into the chat about the first part of your talk, where you were talking about how algorithms are used in criminal risk assessments and that they are showing bias. And the question asks, where does this bias come from? And is it more from the prejudice of those who built the AI system? Is it because these systems are trained on historical data and historical data has bias in it? So that's kind of the part 1, where the part 2, obviously, I wish we all had the answer to this, is how do we try to remove those biases from the system?
So I'm teaching a class right now in the computer science department. It's called Fairness and Automated Decision Making, which answers all of those questions. No, it doesn't really answer them, but it addresses all of those questions as we. So let's take them in 2 parts, right? So part 1, where do these biases come from? And they come from many places. So first of all, there is historical biases. The history of policing in this country is a history of extreme racial prejudice, which means that when you have to train an algorithm to decide whether someone is at risk of anything, of any kind of, let's just say unlawful activity, broadly speaking, you have to collect historical data, which means you have to collect past data of someone's information and whether they were deemed as having committed something unlawful. There was a time when going to a restaurant was unlawful and you could be arrested for it if you went there, if you were Black and you went to a white person's restaurant. That would be data. And that data would be then fed into an algorithm, would say, oh, for this person, this activity counts as unlawful. An algorithm spits out patterns based on what is fed in. So historical biases fed into an algorithm just get turbocharged. That's one part of it. Now, some of the things you can try to address, you can say, okay, look, data from the 50s and 60s and 40s is tainted. We'll use data from more recently. But the problem is it's not as if, biased practices in policing stopped after the Civil Rights Act was passed. For example, in more subtle ways, do the police decide to arrest someone for a certain kind of drug possession versus another? So it's well known that there is a huge discrepancy in which drug crimes are processed, whether they're involving crack or cocaine or marijuana. And these tend to also correlate with who's using them. People with higher socioeconomic status, people who are white using certain kinds of drugs don't get prosecuted as much as those who are poorer from underrepresented groups using other kinds of drugs. So now I have a data set where ostensibly there is no obvious historical bias, but there's a skew based on practices. The thing with algorithms is they're very clever. They're very good at picking up on whatever pattern can be found to get a right answer. They pick up on these patterns. It's not that they will, they do. And so there are subtle patterns like this. There are bigger problems, and there's also interpretation, right? So, maybe someone gets arrested and charged with a crime, a certain kind of crime. Maybe someone else with a different profile gets either not arrested or arrested and charged with a different kind of crime. That's again a pattern. That again goes into the algorithm. So there's a whole bunch of factors relating to how the data is collected, where it's collected from, and how the data is interpreted that cause problems in bias. To your second part of the question, what do we do about it? I don't think the goal is to eliminate, or we can eliminate all kinds of biases in algorithms. That would be a goal if the goal was to only use an algorithm and never have a person looking at the system at all. But our goal, I think, a better goal maybe, and that's why I talked about signals, is to build algorithms that can provide us with signals and sensors and monitoring for potential problems of bias, and elevate them when we can actually think about what the problem is. And, now the question is, well, are you just going to let a biased human being make a decision as opposed to an unbiased algorithm? Well, the answer is you need some clever way to combine things that algorithms do well, ignoring, the fact that I'm hungry and I didn't have my breakfast today and I'm feeling very annoyed and therefore I'm going to be biased in my decision. An algorithm won't do that. Whereas a human might have some contextual knowledge about the person standing in front of them and might understand something about that individual based on their experiences that an algorithm cannot. How do we marry the best of what people can do and the effective things that algorithms can do together? This is still a work in progress, but this is essentially where we all live right now. How do we design good, what I'll call hybrid systems?
Great, thank you. We have another question from the Q&A, which is, we've had carbon dioxide emissions tracking for decades, yet dashboards, tables, and beautiful visuals have not led to meaningful climate action. For social issues, how do technologists identify the point in time when more technology and data cannot help society solve the problem?
That's an amazing question, and that's a really good example. We've talked about climate change forever. It had made no difference. I think the thing with climate change, right, is, I don't know if it was the first, but it was one of the first cases. It was definitely an important example where scientists were forced to confront the fact that data was not enough, that there was a concerted effort, a coordinated campaign to ignore, confuse, and cloud the science that was coming out about climate change. And I don't think scientists were ready, and I think to some extent we are still ready to deal with that. There's plenty of misinformation, plenty of disinformation out there, and I am by no means claiming that data will solve this problem. I guess what I'm claiming is something more modest, that without data we can't even begin, but that we need much more. So it's to get all nerdy on you, it's a necessary but not sufficient condition for having a better discourse. We need it, but it's not enough, and you're absolutely right about that. I think the challenges of understanding tech in society are formidable. I think data can be only one part of it, but we can tell stories with the data. We can collect data of different kinds to help us tell the stories. We don't have to do it ourselves. We have journalism. We have active advocates in the community. We have researchers. We have a lot of people who can bring their own way of telling stories with data to bear on this question, but we have to start somewhere. And I like I said, I don't know what these data sources are going to look like, but I'm convinced that if we start and knowing what we know about the mishaps in the past with, the problems with DNA versus eugenics, with climate data versus climate misinformation, that we've hopefully learned something, but how not only to collect the data, but how to communicate the data in a way that's more effective. I'm an unrequited optimist in that respect. So or a sort of a happy pessimist. Like what else? What other choice do we have? We can't just sit back and just wait for everything to fall apart. So we must try.
Right. So moving forward, we know that technology keeps getting smarter about using our data. And how can we predict how technology will advance so we can protect our data better now? So how do we kind of keep up with it?
So I would like to say that I would not ask the question that way. And here's why. The way the question is asked thinks of technology as this thing, this entity, this alien creature that's moving along, and our job is to predict where it's going. Technology is a car that we are driving. We have our hands on the steering wheel. We do not need to predict where it's going. We can tell it where to go. The whole point of the center that I have here is to help steer the conversation with computer scientists, with technologists, to say, we can imagine a better way to go with our technology. Let's build that. We should not fall into the trap of assuming technology is going to go some way and we have no control over it. We do. We've just given up control and we've forgotten. I mean, I came of age in the 90s when the internet was all possibilities and we could do whatever we wanted. And at some point, I'm not saying the 90s was a great time. There were plenty of other problems with the way we talked about tech and the way it was exclusionary in that period as well. But I felt like we weren't convinced that there was no hope, that we felt that there was a possibility to imagine better. We seem to have gotten to a point now where we are convinced that all we have is Google and Facebook and Twitter and new Twitter, and that's the only way we can interact with the world. It is not. But we have to be able to imagine better, and then we can steer that car of technology where we want it to go. And that's what I would say.
Thank you. So we have another question, which is, how do other parts of the world fit into this conversation, especially with the current AI race? While certain countries are trying to repair, some might continue to dedicate resources without much ethical consideration, possibly towards even more biased surveillances.
If my son came to me and said, my friends are cheating in class and they're getting really good scores, I should do the same thing. I'm hoping that I would tell him, no, you shouldn't. I'm hoping that would be the case, that I would say you shouldn't, and here's why. I think it's very easy to fall into the trap of saying, well, there's a race. We have a mind shaft gap. For those of us who don't know what the reference means, if you don't look it up, there's a race and we have to win the race. It's not a race. It's not a race we need to win. And what does winning even mean? Let's just think about that for a second. You talked about, the question asked about the whole world. The whole world is actually looking for direction right now. The EU, as many of you may be aware, is trying to build their own set of regulations around AI, around a legislation called AI Act, and it's under discussion right now. China has built their own set of guidelines, which are, keeping in line with their way of how to think about the world, which is perhaps a bit more authoritarian, a bit more government controlled than maybe we would like here in the US. Other countries like India, like Singapore, like Spain, like so many countries on the world are now trying to build their own guidelines, and they're looking to broad frameworks like what the EU is doing. And they're frankly looking to the US to provide some guidance, and we haven't done it yet. One thing that we were trying to do and why we tried to do this work at the Build an AI Bill of Rights is to say something reasonable about how we should think about technology in our new world. And people are looking to see what we want to do. So while I might be describing a very US specific context, the world is watching. And they're watching whoever's putting out something interesting to say, what can we adopt for our purposes? So it's up to us to push out guidelines that we think reflect our values, and then make sure and then communicate that to others to see what they would like to pick up as well. And that's where things stand right now.
Thank you. And we have time for one final question. How important, we're going to end on a positive note, how important are grassroots movements in fighting algorithmic and data bias? So what roles does community education have in fighting the misuse of data, particularly for marginalized communities?
When I was first starting to look at issues around pretrial risk assessments, I was talking to some community advocates in Philadelphia, okay, who were working on this. And one of them said, "Have you ever seen a pretrial hearing?" I said, "No, I haven't." So they took me down to the courtroom in central Philadelphia, a courtroom where we could walk in because the ACLU had recently filed a lawsuit against the state government and had gotten access to view the pretrial hearings. So we went in and we watched these hearings be conducted. And the first thing that struck me was, number one, the defendant wasn't there. They were on video screen from the jail that they were sitting in. They weren't even there in the room. Number two, we were obsessing over, in our research, we were obsessing over these scores and these things. The judge had a screen and the score was one little tiny piece of it. It wasn't like, big flashy thing and they could look at it. Number three, we had said, oh yeah, the judge will look at the score and they'll have a discussion with the lawyers and they'll understand what the score says and they'll make some decision. They had 15 seconds to make a decision, or 1 minute, maybe 2 minutes. There was no time to have all these discussions that in theory we thought we could have done. I wouldn't have learned any of that if it weren't for having gone down to the courthouse at the invitation of a community advocate who thought that I needed to see it. Community partners are immensely, they are the soul and the driving force of this work because they understand what the issues are. If we actually want to develop tech that speaks to what people need, we need to know what people need and we need to talk to people. And community advocates do that. They have helped push back on things like facial recognition. They have helped push back on widespread use of surveillance cameras for no particular reason, except as an easier way to get into your building. No, because that data was then being collected and being stolen. Community advocates speak to what communities want. And if we want to build better tech, we have to listen.
Great. Thank you so much. We really appreciate you being our keynote. And we also ask that everyone continue to check out our Love Data Week website to see all of our other events. But thank you so much, Suresh. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me. It was great.
Thank you.